On the morning of March 18, 1981, a woman named Catherine Morrison sat at her desk on the 4th floor of the State Department building in Washington, D.C., reviewing visa applications with the same methodical attention she had brought to the task for the previous 6 years. The office was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Her workspace was modest, a gray metal desk with 2 filing cabinets, a typewriter, and a small window that looked out onto C Street. To anyone who passed by, she appeared to be exactly what her personnel file said she was, a mid-level administrative officer in the Bureau of Consular Affairs, processing paperwork, following procedures, living the unremarkable life of a civil servant in the vast bureaucracy of the federal government. But Catherine Morrison was not who she appeared to be, and the visa applications she was reviewing were not the only documents that crossed her desk. Her real name, according to files that would not be declassified for another 30 years, was Katya Dmitrievna Volkov. She was born in 1949 in Leningrad, the daughter of a naval officer and a music teacher, and she had been recruited by the KGB in 1972 while studying English literature at Leningrad State University. The recruitment had been almost inevitable, given her family background and her demonstrated aptitude for languages. By the time she graduated in 1973, she had already spent months in intensive training at a facility outside Moscow, learning not just tradecraft and intelligence techniques, but how to think, speak, and move like an American. How to hold a fork differently, how to modulate her voice to match regional speech patterns, how to construct a believable personal history that could withstand casual scrutiny, and maybe more. The legend that was created for her was simple and credible. She became Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, born in 1949 in Cleveland, Ohio, to parents who had died in a car accident when she was 19. The death of both parents in a single incident was tragic, but it also had the operational advantage of explaining why there was no family to visit, no relatives who might ask inconvenient questions, no one who could contradict the carefully constructed backstory. Her academic records were real enough. Transcripts from Kent State University that showed a degree in political science, completed in 1971, along with employment history that placed her in various administrative positions before she applied to the State Department in 1974. The records were forgeries, sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless, planted in files and databases by operatives who had been working years ahead to prepare for insertions like this, and they were good enough to pass the background check that the State Department conducted before offering her a position in early 1975. Catherine had entered the United States in late 1974, crossing the border from Canada, with a passport that identified her as an American citizen returning from a vacation. The passport was genuine in the sense that it had been issued by the United States government, but the identity it represented was fiction. She settled in a small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, found temporary work at a law office to establish a paper trail, and began the slow, careful process of becoming Catherine Morrison in every way that mattered. She learned the rhythms of American life, not from textbooks this time, but from lived experience. How grocery stores operated, what people talked about at bus stops, which television shows were popular, how to navigate the social expectations of a single woman in her mid-20s trying to build a career in Washington. By the time she applied for the position at the State Department 6 months after arriving, she had refined the performance to the point where it was no longer quite a performance. The mask had begun to fuse with her face. The State Department was an ideal target for Soviet intelligence. It housed information about American foreign policy, diplomatic communications, visa processing that could reveal patterns about who the United States was granting or denying entry to, which was valuable intelligence in its own right. But more than that, it was a building full of people who had access to classified information, people who traveled internationally, people who might be vulnerable to recruitment or compromise. Catherine's position in the Bureau of Consular Affairs was deliberately low-level, the kind of job that attracted minimal scrutiny precisely because it seemed so mundane. She processed visa applications, reviewed documentation, corresponded with embassies abroad about procedural matters. It was paperwork, endless paperwork, and most of it was exactly as boring as it appeared. But buried within that paperwork, occasionally, were details that Moscow wanted to know about. Who was applying for visas to travel to the Soviet Union or Eastern Bloc countries, and why? Who was being denied, and what the official reasons were versus the unofficial ones. What patterns existed in diplomatic travel that might suggest shifts in American policy or intelligence operations. Catherine's method of intelligence gathering was painstakingly slow and careful. She did not photograph documents in the office, did not smuggle files out of the building, did not do anything that would create obvious risk. Instead, she memorized information. Names, dates, details from applications that crossed her desk. At the end of each workday, she would go home to her small apartment in Arlington, make dinner for herself, and then spend the next hour writing in a journal that appeared to be nothing more than a personal diary. The entries were mundane descriptions of her day, what she had for lunch, what she watched on television, complaints about traffic or coworkers. But embedded within that bland text were coded references to the information she had gathered, details that would mean nothing to anyone reading casually, but that could be decoded by someone who knew the system. Once or twice a month, she would take this journal with her when she went out for her evening walk, a routine she had established early on to avoid suspicion. She walked the same route through her neighborhood most nights, a loop that took about 45 minutes and ended at a small park 2 blocks from her apartment. And during these walks, at irregular intervals, determined by a schedule her handlers had provided, she would leave the journal in a dead drop, a hiding spot where it could be retrieved by a contact she never saw and never communicated with directly. The dead drop was located in Rock Creek Park, in a section that was popular with joggers and dog walkers during the day, but largely empty after dark. There was a drainage culvert beneath a footbridge, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, where a loose brick could be removed to reveal a small cavity behind it. Catherine would stop on the bridge, ostensibly to tie her shoe or adjust her jacket, and in that brief moment, she would slip the journal into the cavity, replace the brick, and continue walking. A few hours later, sometimes the same night, sometimes the following day, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the embassy would retrieve the journal, photograph the pages, and return it to the same location. Catherine would collect it on her next walk, and the cycle would continue. The system was slow, deliberate, and virtually impossible to detect unless someone was specifically watching for it, which, as far as Catherine knew, no one was. Her life in those years was defined by routine and isolation. The routine was operational necessity. The consistency of her schedule helped establish her as unremarkable, a woman whose habits were predictable and boring. But the isolation was something else, a psychological burden that grew heavier with each passing year. She had no real friends, at least not in the sense that most people understood friendship. She had co-workers she was cordial with, neighbors she exchanged pleasantries with in the hallway, but no one she could be honest with about who she actually was or what she was actually doing. The loneliness of deep cover work is difficult to articulate to people who have never experienced it. It is not simply being alone. It is being surrounded by people while maintaining an impenetrable barrier between yourself and everyone around you. Every conversation is filtered. Every interaction is calculated. Every moment of apparent intimacy is fundamentally false. Catherine found small ways to cope. She read extensively, novels mostly. books she could lose herself in for a few hours at a time. She went to movies alone, sitting in the back row of theaters and watching stories about other people's lives unfold on screen. She developed a habit of taking long walks on weekends, exploring neighborhoods throughout Washington, observing the architecture and the people without having to engage directly with anyone. These activities provided a sense of normalcy, or at least the illusion of it, but they could not fully compensate for the absence of genuine human connection. There were moments, late at night or early in the morning, when the weight of what she was doing threatened to overwhelm her. Moments when she wondered what her life would have been like if she had made different choices, if she had refused the recruitment, if she had pursued a normal career in Leningrad instead of accepting this mission. But those thoughts were dangerous, not just operationally, but psychologically, and she learned to suppress them, to focus instead on the task at hand and the belief, however tenuous, that what she was doing served a larger purpose. The nature of her work changed somewhat in 1978, when she was transferred within the Bureau of Consular Affairs to a position that involved coordinating with the Office of Security on visa applications that raised potential concerns. It was a lateral move, not a promotion exactly, but it came with access to a different category of information. Now she was seeing not just routine applications, but cases where applicants had been flagged for additional scrutiny. People with criminal records, people who had been denied visas previously, people whose travel patterns or stated reasons for entering the United States did not quite align with what the security office expected. This was more valuable intelligence, and it also came with more risk. The Office of Security was staffed by people trained to look for anomalies, for patterns that did not fit, for individuals who might pose a threat. Catherine was acutely aware that she was now working in closer proximity to people whose job was to find people like her. She adapted by becoming even more careful, even more methodical. She stopped taking notes entirely, relying solely on memory to retain information until she could record it at home. She varied the timing of her dead drop visits, never establishing a pattern that could be predicted or observed. She limited the amount of information she passed, focusing only on the most relevant details rather than trying to document everything she saw. And she cultivated a reputation within the office as someone who was competent, but not ambitious, reliable, but not particularly memorable. She wanted to be the kind of employee who did her job well enough to avoid criticism, but not so well that she attracted attention. It was a delicate balance, and maintaining it required constant vigilance. In the spring of 1979, Catherine became aware of something that would alter the trajectory of her operation. During a routine review of flagged visa applications, she came across a file for a man named Alexei Petrov, a Soviet citizen who had applied for a temporary visa to attend an engineering conference in Boston. The application had been denied, which was not unusual. Soviet citizens were routinely denied visas during this period, unless they had compelling reasons and credible assurances that they would return home. But what caught Catherine's attention was the notation in the security review section. Petrov was not just a Soviet engineer. He was identified as a possible intelligence officer, someone who had been observed meeting with known KGB operatives during previous trips to Western Europe. The denial of his visa was not a routine bureaucratic decision. It was a counterintelligence operation, an effort to prevent a suspected spy from entering the United States. Catherine understood immediately that this information was significant. Moscow would want to know that Petrov had been identified, that his cover was compromised, that he could no longer operate effectively in the West. She also understood that passing this information carried considerable risk. The file on Petrov was classified, and access to it was logged. If the information made its way back to Moscow and Petrov was suddenly reassigned, or his operations changed in response, American counterintelligence might begin looking for the source of the leak. And if they started looking, they might eventually trace it back to her. She spent 2 days agonizing over the decision, weighing the operational value of the intelligence against the personal risk of exposure. In the end, she decided to pass it along, encoding the details in her journal and leaving it at the dead drop on schedule. She told herself that the information was too important to withhold, that her duty required her to take the risk. But she also knew, on some level, that she was rationalizing, that the decision was as much about proving her value to her handlers as it was about serving the mission. 3 weeks after she passed the information, Catherine noticed something that made her blood run cold. A man she had never seen before appeared in the cafeteria on the 4th floor, sitting alone at a table near the windows, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him. He could have been any one of thousands of government employees who worked in the building. But Catherine had developed an instinct for anomalies, and something about this man set off alarms in her mind. He sat facing the entrance, positioning himself where he could observe everyone who came and went. He stayed for nearly an hour, long enough that it could not have been a quick lunch break. And when he finally left, he walked past Catherine's desk on his way to the elevator, glancing briefly in her direction before continuing down the hall. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Catherine had been trained to notice small things. And what she noticed was that the man's gaze had lingered just a fraction of a second too long, as though he were cataloging her face, confirming an identification. She did not panic. Panic was the enemy of operational security. Instead, she finished her workday as she always did, processed the remaining files on her desk, locked her cabinets, and left the building at her usual time. She took her usual route home, walked at her usual pace, stopped at the same grocery store she always stopped at on Wednesdays to pick up milk and bread. But the entire time, she was watching, using reflections in store windows and car mirrors to check if she was being followed. She did not see anyone, but that meant nothing. Surveillance teams were trained to be invisible, and if the man in the cafeteria was part of a counterintelligence operation, he would not be working alone. There would be multiple agents, rotating positions, using vehicles and communication equipment to track her movements without being detected. She walked home, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and closed the door behind her, with hands that were shaking slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. Over the next several days, Catherine continued her normal routine while conducting her own counter-surveillance. She varied her walking route slightly, testing to see if anyone adjusted their movements to match hers. She started taking different modes of transportation to work, sometimes the bus, sometimes the metro, once even calling a taxi, watching to see if any vehicles followed her consistently. She began paying attention to faces in crowds, looking for repeats, for people who appeared in multiple locations at different times, and she found them. Not the man from the cafeteria, but others. A woman in a gray coat who was on the same metro car 2 mornings in a row. A man in a blue sedan who seemed to be parked on her street more often than coincidence would explain. A jogger in the park who ran past her at the exact same time on 2 consecutive evenings, despite the fact that Catherine had deliberately changed the time of her walks. She was under surveillance. There was no longer any question about it. The protocols for this situation were clear. If an operative suspected they were under surveillance, they were to cease all intelligence activity immediately, break contact with their handlers, and wait for instructions. Under no circumstances were they to attempt to make a dead drop or communicate through established channels, as doing so would confirm suspicions and provide evidence that could be used to arrest them. Catherine followed these protocols. She stopped writing in her journal beyond bland, genuinely personal entries about her day. She stopped taking her evening walks to the park entirely, claiming when asked by a neighbor that she had developed knee pain and was resting it. She became, to all outward appearances, nothing more than what she was supposed to be, a State Department bureaucrat, living a quiet, unremarkable life. But inside, she was calculating. How long could she maintain this? How long would the surveillance continue before either escalating to arrest or being called off as unproductive? And what would she do if she received a signal from her handlers indicating that she needed to extract herself immediately? The signal, when it came, arrived in the most mundane way possible. On the morning of April 27, 1981, Catherine received a postcard in her mailbox. It was addressed to her, postmarked from Miami, and featured a generic photograph of palm trees and beaches. The message on the back was brief and innocuous, just a few lines about someone named Susan having a wonderful vacation and wishing Catherine was there. Catherine did not know anyone named Susan, but she recognized the postcard immediately for what it was, an emergency communication from her handlers. The specific wording, the choice of Miami as the postage location, the date it was sent, all of these details corresponded to a prearranged code that indicated Catherine was compromised and needed to leave the country as soon as possible. The message was clear. Her years of operation were over. She had been identified, or was about to be, and the only option remaining was extraction. Catherine sat at her kitchen table, staring at the postcard for a long time. She thought about the life she had built here, the apartment with its familiar furniture and the view of the street below, the routine that had become so ingrained it felt almost real. She thought about the people at work, the co-workers who smiled at her in the hallway and asked about her weekends, who had no idea who she actually was. She thought about the years she had spent in this role, the information she had gathered and passed along, the small contribution she had made to a conflict that seemed increasingly abstract the longer she remained embedded in American life. And she thought about what would happen if she stayed, if she ignored the signal and continued pretending everything was normal. They would arrest her eventually, probably soon. She would be interrogated, charged with espionage, sentenced to decades in federal prison. The life she had built, fake though it was, would be destroyed, and she would spend whatever remained of her years behind bars, forgotten by everyone except the intelligence services that had created her. The extraction plan had been established years earlier, during her initial training, and she had reviewed it periodically to ensure she remembered the details. She was to take a specific series of actions in a specific order, each one designed to minimize the risk of being followed or intercepted. First, she would call in sick to work, claiming a severe flu that would keep her home for at least a week. This would buy her time before anyone noticed she was gone. Then she would empty her bank account, taking as much cash as possible without triggering reporting requirements that might alert authorities. She would destroy any materials in her apartment that could be used as evidence, her journal, her code books, anything that connected her to the operation. She would pack a single small bag with essential items, nothing that would seem unusual if someone searched it. And then she would leave, walking out of her apartment as though she were going to the store or the doctor, and never returning. The actual route out of the country had been mapped in advance. She would take a bus to Richmond, Virginia, then another bus to Charleston, South Carolina. In Charleston, she would meet a contact at a prearranged location, a man who would provide her with false documents and tickets for a flight to Mexico City. From Mexico City, she would fly to Havana, and from Havana, she would be transported back to the Soviet Union. The entire journey would take approximately 3 days, assuming everything went according to plan. And if it did not, if she was stopped at any point, she had been given a final contingency. A small pill sewn into the lining of her jacket that would kill her within minutes if she chose to take. Tia. The KGB did not want operatives captured alive, and they provided the means to avoid that outcome. Catherine Morrison, or Katya Volkov, or whatever her real name was at this point, called in sick to the State Department on April 28th. Her supervisor, a man named Gerald, who managed the consular affairs section, expressed concern and told her to rest and feel better. She thanked him and hung up the phone, then spent the next hour systematically destroying everything in her apartment that could incriminate her. She burned her journal page by page in the kitchen sink, running water over the ashes until they dissolved into gray sludge that washed down the drain. She tore apart the lining of her coat where she had hidden spare code sheets, shredding the papers into tiny pieces and flushing them down the toilet in small batches. She wiped down surfaces, packed her bag, and took one last look around the apartment that had been her home for 6 years. Then she walked out the door, locked it behind her, and dropped the key in a storm drain 2 blocks away. The bus ride to Richmond was uneventful. Catherine sat near the back, staring out the window at the Virginia countryside rolling past, trying not to think about what she was leaving behind or what awaited her when she finally returned to the Soviet Union. She had been gone for 7 years. Her parents were older now. Her father retired from the Navy. Her mother still teaching music, but probably thinking about retirement herself. Would they even recognize her? Would she recognize the city she had left behind? Or would it feel as foreign to her as America had felt when she first arrived? The questions circled in her mind without answers, and eventually she stopped trying to find them. She slept for part of the journey, a fitful, uncomfortable sleep that left her feeling more exhausted than when she started. By the time the bus pulled into Charleston, it was late evening, and Catherine was running on adrenaline and coffee. The contact in Charleston was a man she had never met before, someone the KGB had positioned years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. He was waiting at the designated location, a park bench near the waterfront, reading a newspaper in the fading light. Catherine approached, sat down beside him without speaking, and waited. After a few minutes, the man folded his newspaper, stood up, and walked away, leaving behind a manila envelope that had been tucked beneath the folded paper. Catherine picked up the envelope, opened it carefully, and found a passport, a driver's license, and an airline ticket. The passport identified her as Laura Bennett, a Canadian citizen traveling on business. The ticket was for a flight leaving Charleston the following morning, connecting through Atlanta to Mexico City. Along with these documents was $5,000 in cash, enough to cover incidentals and emergencies during the journey. Catherine put everything in her bag, left the park, and checked into a small motel near the airport using the Laura Bennett identity. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of traffic on the highway outside, thinking about the life she was leaving and the one she was returning to. The flight to Mexico City departed on schedule. Catherine, now Laura Bennett, passed through security without incident, boarded the plane, and found her seat near the window. She watched through the glass as the ground fell away beneath her, as Charleston became a pattern of lights and then a memory. She changed planes in Atlanta, again without incident, and by late afternoon, she was landing in Mexico City, clearing customs with her Canadian passport and walking out into the chaos of the airport terminal. She found a taxi, gave the driver an address that had been written on a slip of paper in the envelope, and spent the next 40 minutes navigating traffic through the sprawling city. The address led to a safe house in a residential neighborhood, an unremarkable building where a woman answered the door and ushered her inside without speaking. Catherine stayed there for 2 days, waiting for arrangements to be finalized, eating meals that were brought to her, sleeping in a small room with barred windows and a single bed. On the 3rd day, a man arrived with new documents and tickets for the flight to Havana. And from Havana, she was transported by ship back to the Soviet Union, arriving in Murmansk on May 10th, 1981, 43 days after she had sat at her desk in the State Department and reviewed visa applications for the last time. The debriefing process took weeks. Catherine was taken to a facility outside Moscow where KGB officers questioned her about every aspect of her operation. They wanted to know what she had observed, what information she had passed, what had gone wrong, and how she had known to extract herself when she did. She answered their questions as completely as she could, providing details about the surveillance she had detected, the man in the cafeteria, the woman in the gray coat, the pattern she had noticed that indicated she was being watched. The officers took notes, asked follow-up questions, and occasionally conferred in low voices before returning their attention to her. They seemed satisfied, eventually, that she had acted appropriately, that she had followed protocol and had not compromised the operation more than was unavoidable. But there was no praise, no sense of accomplishment. She had done her job, and now that job was over, and she was simply another former operative being processed back into Soviet life. Catherine, or Katya, as she was once again called, was reassigned to a desk job within the KGB's archives department, a position that involved cataloging intelligence reports and maintaining records. It was bureaucratic work, similar in many ways to what she had done in Washington, but without the weight of deception, without the constant fear of exposure. She lived in a small apartment in Moscow, visited her parents occasionally, and tried to adjust to being back in a country that felt both familiar and strange. The years she had spent in America had changed her in ways she had not fully anticipated. She found herself missing small things, the convenience of American grocery stores, the variety of television programming, the relative openness of conversations in public spaces. These were superficial details, but they pointed to something deeper, a sense of dislocation that never entirely went away. She had spent so long pretending to be someone else that returning to her original identity felt, in some ways, like adopting a new cover. Back in Washington, the FBI had indeed been investigating Catherine Morrison. The surveillance she had detected was part of a broader counterintelligence operation that had been tracking several suspected Soviet operatives within government agencies. When Catherine failed to return to work after calling in sick, and when subsequent attempts to contact her went unanswered, agents went to her apartment and found it empty. Her disappearance confirmed what they had suspected, that she was a KGB officer operating under deep cover. A search of her apartment yielded little in the way of evidence. She had been thorough in her cleanup, leaving behind only the ordinary possessions of an ordinary life: furniture, clothes, books, nothing that could definitively prove espionage. But her absence was proof enough. The State Department was quietly informed that one of their employees had been a Soviet spy, and an internal review was conducted to assess what damage she might have done, and what vulnerabilities had allowed her to operate undetected for 6 years. The case of Catherine Morrison, or Katya Volkov, was classified and remained so for decades. It was one of many such cases during the Cold War, instances where Soviet intelligence successfully inserted operatives into American institutions, where those operatives gathered information for years before being detected or extracting themselves. The specific intelligence she passed was assessed as valuable but not catastrophic. She had not stolen nuclear secrets or exposed major operations, but she had provided Moscow with detailed insights into how the State Department processed visas, how security reviews were conducted, and who was being flagged for additional scrutiny. This information allowed the KGB to adjust their own operations, to avoid sending officers who were already compromised, to exploit gaps in American procedures. It was the kind of incremental advantage that intelligence agencies valued highly, the accumulation of small pieces of information that, taken together, provided a clearer picture of the adversary's capabilities and intentions. For Katya Volkov, the years that followed her return were defined by a kind of quiet resignation. She had served her country, she had done what was asked of her, but the cost had been her youth, her opportunity for a normal life, her ability to form genuine relationships. She remained single, never marrying, never having children. She worked her desk job, attended required political meetings, and lived a life that was, in its own way, as isolated as the one she had lived in America. The difference was that here, the isolation was not operational necessity. It was simply the aftermath of having spent too many years pretending to be someone else, of having lost the ability to be fully herself with anyone. She retired from the KGB in 1995, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the organization she had served no longer existed in its original form. She received a modest pension and continued living in her small Moscow apartment, occasionally reading American novels in English, walking through neighborhoods as she had once walked through Washington, observing without engaging. The story of Catherine Morrison is not unique in the annals of Cold War espionage, but it is representative of a particular kind of operation that the Soviet Union executed with considerable success. The deep cover agent, embedded in mundane positions within the target country's bureaucracy, gathering information slowly and carefully over the course of years. These operatives were not glamorous. They were not stealing missile codes or meeting contacts in dark alleys. They were sitting at desks, processing paperwork, and remembering details that could be passed along through carefully constructed channels. And the psychological cost of this work was immense, because it required not just deception, but sustained, comprehensive deception. The kind that turned a person's entire existence into a performance, with no intermission, no break, no moment when the mask could be safely removed. What makes this story particularly haunting is not the espionage itself, but the human cost. Catherine Morrison, or Katya Volkov, spent 6 years of her life living as someone she was not, in a country that was not her home, serving a cause that required her to betray the trust of everyone around her. And when it was over, when she returned to the Soviet Union and resumed her original identity, she found that she could not simply pick up where she had left off. The years of deception had changed her, had left her fundamentally disconnected from both the life she had lived and the one she had returned to. She existed in a kind of liminal space, belonging fully to neither world, carrying with her the knowledge of what she had done and the understanding that there was no going back. The broader implications of cases like this extended far beyond the individual operative. They reinforced the paranoia that permeated government institutions during the Cold War, the understanding that Soviet agents could be anywhere, embedded in any office, living seemingly normal lives while working against American interests. This paranoia was not entirely unjustified, as the existence of operatives like Catherine Morrison demonstrated, but it also contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that affected countless innocent people who found themselves investigated simply because they fit a profile or had an unusual background. The damage extended in multiple directions, affecting not just national security, but the fabric of ordinary professional life, where colleagues learned to be suspicious of each other, where friendships were constrained by security concerns, where the simple act of working for the government became fraught with implications that went far beyond the actual job. In the end, the story of Katya Volkov is a story about the cost of ideology, about what happens when nations ask individuals to sacrifice their identities, their relationships, their very selves in service of larger geopolitical objectives. It is a story about the Cold War, not as a series of crises and confrontations, but as a daily reality for people who lived in the spaces between, who maintained cover identities, who passed information, who existed in a state of permanent tension between who they were and who they pretended to be. It is a story without heroes or clear moral lessons, because the reality of espionage during that era was messy and morally ambiguous, and the people involved were rarely purely good or purely evil. They were just people trying to navigate impossible situations with incomplete information and conflicting loyalties, making choices that seemed necessary at the time and living with the consequences long after the conflict that gave those choices meaning had ended. Katya Volkov is still alive, according to the most recent information available. She is in her 70s now, living in Moscow, a retired intelligence officer with no family and few friends, spending her days much as she spent them in Washington, reading, walking, observing the world from a careful distance. She has never spoken publicly about her years of service, and it is unlikely that she ever will. The details of her operation remain classified in large part, accessible only to researchers with specific clearance. But her story, like thousands of others from that era, serves as a reminder of what the Cold War actually looked like for the people who fought it. Not dramatic confrontations or heroic actions, but quiet rooms and ordinary desks, and the slow accumulation of information gathered by individuals who had given up everything else to be invisible. And the cost of that invisibility, the psychological and emotional toll of living a lie for years on end, was a cost that could never be fully calculated or repaid.